had to be about 8 years old at the time, so I was in the 3rd grade. And you know, it was very hostile, very violent, and you know, I've been thinking about all of this. And you know, there's a spot on Dorchester Ave, like when we were on the bus, we had to get below the windows and hide in our seats because of the things that were being hurled at the bus every single day. So imagine you're an 8-year-old and this was your daily experience.
I've heard from so many people over the last few days, people I call heroes and heroines, former Boston public school teachers, former Boston school students who lived and walked these in the shoes of these courageous young people. I've heard from community activists and others who very much wanted to be a part of this evening's conversation. You are part of this history, you are part of this story, and I'm so grateful for your participation in this evening's program. We have a wonderful panel assembled this evening, and I'll introduce them in a short moment. But they will share their lived experiences, their heartfelt lived experiences and research on busing in Boston. They'll talk about what has changed and what has not changed since Brown v. Board of Education and corridor desegregation, and how hard-fought gains of desegregation have been reversed in school districts across the country and in Boston as well. Schools that are now more segregated than before the courts intervened. The panel will discuss what an equitable Boston public school system looks like and explore the current state of racial equity in Boston and the long-term impacts of busing on the city and its reputation. I'd like to recognize our program sponsors, the Moakley Art Institute and Archive, GBH Forum Network, the Office of Diversity, Access, and Inclusion at Suffolk University, and the Boston Desegregation and Busing Initiative. I'd like to do a special acknowledgement to Lou Finfer, who's been fighting the good fight for many, many years. Lou, thank you so much for joining us. He's one of the persons spearheading that desegregation initiative. I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. And to our robust Zoom audience, welcome. You are here with us in spirit, and we want you to know that your presence is greatly appreciated. As you know, your microphones are muted, your cameras have been turned off, but we do want to hear from you. We've received many, many questions over the course of the last few days from registrants, and we invite those of you who haven't already submitted questions to continue to submitting them in the Q&A box. The box will be monitored, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. In order to begin the conversation, the planners, GBH, and a group of us thought that it would be important to have some historical context of the events leading up to the Garrity decision. And so we're going to dim the lights and show a timeline. And I want to give a special shout out to Andrew Vanas, the legal intern Gabriel Reed, and Michael Della Iacono from the Moakley Archives for their work putting this together. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's panel. Zebulon Miletsky is a son of Boston, an associate professor of Africana Studies at Stonybrook University, and the author of the acclaimed new book, Before Busing, A History of Boston's Long Black Freedom Struggle. Alisa Drayton, a third-generation Bostonian, and she is this beautiful queen in the hot pink outfit. Alisa is the executive director of the Yawkey Club of Roxbury, Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston. And finally, our queen in the greenish outfit is Marilyn Flowers-Marion, also a Bostonian and a longtime Boston public school teacher who spent her career mostly in the high school level and during the turbulent times of court-order desegregation, primarily at Hyde Park High School. The evening's moderator is Adrian Walker, Metro columnist at the Boston Globe. In his 25 years at the Globe, Adrian has fearlessly chronicled race, education, housing equity, the myriad of issues that really impact democracy for the citizens of Boston. I'm so pleased that you have agreed to moderate this panel, and I want to thank you, Zebulon, Marilyn, and Alisa for joining us this evening. I'm now going to toss it to you, Adrian.
Zebulon, I want to start with you, the author of this fine book, Before Busing. You know, for so many of us here, even people who feel like we know a lot of the story, if the story of busing is thought to begin on the first day of school in 1974. But in fact, it goes back much farther than that. Can you talk to us a bit about the road that led up to court-ordered desegregation?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the compliment on the book. I appreciate that. You know, I think to really fully understand the whole story of court-ordered desegregation, busing, school desegregation in Boston, we've got to go back to a case not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. A young girl by the name of Sarah Roberts and her father, you know, decided to sue the city of Boston, and we saw it on the timeline that we just watched, because she had to walk by about 5 white schools in order to go to the only school that admitted black students in Boston, the A.B.L. Smith School at that time. And they felt that was unfair, and her father retained one of the only and one of the leading black attorneys in America to take on the suit, and they sued the city. It was a lot like Brown versus Board, but a little way before that time and a little before its time, because they didn't win their lawsuit. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court sided with the city of Boston and basically said that it was constitutional, in their opinion, for Boston to maintain separate schools, black and white. This wasn't a class action suit. There were a lot of other parents, just kind of like this story, that felt all different kinds of ways. But that legal precedent having been established on the books, as they say, eventually gets cited in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the sort of notorious Supreme Court decision that established separate but equal. So it's not a stretch to say that Jim Crow starts in Boston, not South Carolina, not Mississippi, not down south, but here in the north and in Boston in particular. The parents and organizers at that time rally and push to get the Mass State Legislature to pass basically a law that says there can't be any segregated schools in Massachusetts. And that comes in 1855, a lot of people will cite that victory without realizing that Roberts was actually a loss in terms of the legal precedent. But I think that sets the tone. It's important to know that this struggle for equitable schooling and for a desegregated system goes all the way back to the 19th century. And a lot of it happened right around here. The Abiel Smith School actually started in the basement of Prince Hall, who founded the Black Masons. His son, Primus Hall, basically opened up his home. And then it moved to several different buildings, mostly right here near the African Meeting House. But so, that struggle to fight for equitable education has two bookends, one in the 19th century and one in the more current period. But the thing that they have in common is the sort of the dreams and the willingness to go to almost any length in order to provide quality education. And I mean any length. You see all the different strategies that were attempted, freedom schools, establishing their own schools in order to provide that kind of education, Operation Exodus, all the different voluntary school integration in the suburbs with Metco, and all these different attempts. And finally, in the face of a very immovable Boston School Committee, the courts. And that's where Morgan versus Hennigan, that case basically begins. It was the court of last resort, as they thought of it at that time. And because it was done in the courts that way, it was a very strong medicine for Boston, because the school committee was essentially not willing to follow the law. And so yeah, that's the context. And they bring that suit in 1972. It took 2 years to go through the courts.
I mean, just to get a sense of how long ago, how early the Roberts case was, there was no federal civil rights law to sue under, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really didn't exist.
No, there wasn't. There were some interesting. There was a law in Massachusetts that they were able to try to utilize, but it wasn't at the federal level. They were very creative as well, trying to. But truthfully, this was a very courageous and bold act of one family, from what I could tell, without the support of a lot of other Black families that were involved in this. A lot of people said, this may not be the best way to go. And in fact, a lot of people supported the Abiel Smith School and other schools like it and said, why don't we try to strengthen the schools that we have? But yeah, no, this would have been way before those kinds of federal laws. And in this case, because of the strange way that legal precedent works, it had, like Plessy versus Ferguson, the law of unintended consequences.
Of course. Marilyn, you were a teacher in the Boston Public Schools in 1974.
I was,
Can you tell us about that?
at the end of 74, 75, I was sent to Dorchester High School, and that was one of the schools that was supposed to receive students from South Boston. But a bus came, nobody on it, in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Someone came to get the kids from the schools, but nobody was on it. The school, there were a few white students, but many had fled Dorchester High. I was in the annex, which was just all 9th grade, because Dorchester High was really, really packed with students. And so we were in one building, and it was a little hairy. You never knew what was going to happen. But the kids, if you treat kids with respect, and they won't act up. And this was my first teaching experience. I think what had happened, the kids had so many substitutes that came in and out, and I was one of the substitutes that came in. But we had a very successful year. Very successful, because I said, I'm not taking any nonsense. This young woman, little girl to me, and she said, well, you know, we got rid of the last sub, and I'm going to get rid of you. I said, oh, no, you're not. You're going first. And she chuckled, and we got along. She helped me because I met her where she was. And it was very difficult, yes. The neighborhood was kind of in transition.
What part of Dorchester was it?
What kind of what?
What part of Dorchester were you
It
in?
was up in Cardinal Square.
Okay.
That's where Dorchester High was. But we were on Southern Avenue, which is just off of Talbot Avenue. And I think there were only 2 black faculty members, myself and another teacher that was on the faculty. And I wasn't pleased with many of the faculty who would have the kids circle and underline. They weren't teaching.
Wow. Did the white students ever show up?
Why did I show up?
Did the white students ever show up? Or were they all dropping out of the
Yeah,
system?
those who were going to be there were there. The bus eventually stopped coming because that was a waste of time. Empty bus coming and going.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction before I went to Hyde Park High School, which was a different story.
We'll get to that. Alisa Drayton, you have some personal experience with busing.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes. I was bused to the Condon School in South Boston from Roxbury.
How old were you?
Had to be about 8 years old at the time, so I was in the 3rd grade. And, you know, it was very hostile, very violent, and, you know, I've been thinking about all of this. And, you know, there's a spot on Dorchester Ave, like when we were on the bus, we had to get below the windows and hide in our seats because of the things that were being hurled at the bus every single day. So imagine you're an 8-year-old and this was your daily experience. And currently we talk about bullying and the epidemic that it is in our schools and our community. And I thought about it, we were kids being bullied by adults. And, you know, it was a space where, you know, we got down in our seat, we had to stay below the windows, they hurried you into the school, and we stayed in that building all day. My room was on the 2nd floor, and I could see this big open field, but we could never go outside and play for recess because there were housing projects around it. And the one time that I do recall that they did let us out, we went a little bit further in the field than we were supposed to, and some kids from the housing project jumped the fence and just spit in the face of one of my classmates. I can still see it to this day. But that's what we dealt with every single day. I mean, there's a few things I recall from my experience dealing with teachers, but it was just that anxiety of going to school every day in that environment, you know. And, you know, I've been rehashing and remembering some things talking to my mother. And because of forced busing, I was bused to a different school every year in different communities. So I was a part of this big experience. But I don't think anyone took the time to understand the impact it would have on a young child. And my cousins who lived down the street in Roxbury, they were going to Charlestown and South Boston High. So my entire family was impacted by that. But I was the youngest of them all going through that. You know, like I said, I have some memories of inside the building, but most of my memories are going to and from school because that's where I was the most vulnerable. And it was one of those places where your parent couldn't come and get you, you know. And my mom said, you know, we put you, and we just prayed. We didn't have cell phones. It's not as if they could jump on the MBTA or a bus to come get me or anything like that. It was like the bus in the morning and the bus afternoon to get you home. And they had to pour a lot of love and a lot of faith and and just encouraged me, to go out there for the next day.
What did your parents tell you? I mean, how did you deal with this as a family?
One of the things the elders coming from the South, they let us know that it had nothing to do with us, that it was a reflection of the ignorance of other people, that they, I'm a third generation Bostonian, so I knew there were certain places that we could not go. Dudley or Nubian Square, that was our downtown. It was just things that just encouraged me to say that I'm going to be okay. It wasn't a reflection of me, and that I just focused on my schoolwork.
Can we talk a little bit about the heroes of busing? Zeb, you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I like that. Yeah, I think that as I hear the comments and think about Ruth Batson was a reluctant hero in some ways. She thought very carefully, it seems to me, in my opinion, about what the outcomes would be or the impact would be, especially on Black children in particular, and had reservations sometimes about that, and really was very thoughtful, it seems to me, about the different options. But Ruth Batson is someone, a name that everyone in Boston should know. She was kind of sort of fearless in a lot of ways, and just a humble, regular person in so many ways. She was a mom. She came from interesting background. She, in part, came from some experiences with public housing, and came up in the heart of Roxbury. Knew a lot of people, and had a way with people talking to them. She was talking to other parents and hearing, some students were getting science projects and all these kind of interesting assignments, but her kids were not getting challenged in that way, and she did the thing that a lot of us don't always have the courage to do, is just to ask why, and to ask the powers that be these kinds of questions. She sought out the NAACP and said, what are you doing about this? And they said, well, we have an education division, but it doesn't really do much. They talked, and then a couple of days later, they called her and said, "You're the new chair of the education subcommittee for the NAACP." And from there, she just, she became the model of that kind of grassroots organizing that's powerfully symbolic, but also effective in terms of creating change, and doing so just through regular people. It is truly a kind of a, sort of a from the bottom up, kind of thing, creating goodwill, bringing people together, and eventually she brought some very powerful people together who called upon her to give some ideas of models, and it produced a lot of things like Metco. And eventually the decision to take the case to federal court, and that's where she, I think, had some. She worried a lot about sending, the children of the community, the Black community, into the lion's den, and that's not a small thing. That's a very big thing, because it made. As Alicia was saying, it made the children, sort of the avant-garde, the front, guard in terms of this social justice struggle and a struggle for educational equity, and it's not a small thing, because it left scars, it left marks, and that's clear to me from having interviewed a lot of people, and I don't, that's not a small thing at all. It's an amazing achievement in terms of creating social change in the city of Boston and in the Boston schools in a lot of ways. But it didn't come at small cost to people.
What did she hope would come out of desegregation? What was the hope for it?
Well, I think it was in the clip, but you know, thing that she would always remark on is, you know, she noticed that where the white schools were, that's where the money went, that's where the resources were, and it's important that people understand that, like, the so-called a school can't be a race, you know, but the black schools, or the schools in the black community, were in the oldest buildings. They're falling down, you know, kind of thing where, you know, the roof might be leaking. They had very little resources, and then the books and resources they did had lessons that were damaging, you know, books like Little Black Sambo, and other things like that. You know, I come along a little after that, but I can tell you that, you know, to the mind of a child, I mean, if you're looking for a way to sort of really destroy people, you know, in a sense, that's a pretty good way to do it, you know. And but I think so. So what she was looking for was a strategic move that was not perfect by any means, but one that she thought might help black students in Boston who were really suffering then under this system get a more quality education. Without education, you can't get a job. You know, you can't get a good job. You can't be part of this Massachusetts miracle, this economy that's benefited a lot of people. You can't be part of all those good things without an education. And so I think that's what she hoped for. It was a pragmatic move for her.
Marilyn, you spent years in the Boston Public Schools. Talk to us about what you think the educational impact of desegregation was. Was it good? Was it bad? What did it do?
A little bit good, a little bit bad. We hired black teachers. There were a lot more teachers that were being hired. And I run the retired teachers chapter of the BTU, so I know a lot of those teachers that came in 1974, 1975, 76. Boston Public Schools went everywhere to recruit teachers to come to Boston. Some said, I don't think so, because we were on TV a lot, so they didn't want to come to Boston, but they really, really struggled to find teachers, black teachers, to come to Boston. So, but there were many of us who did make it through the system. It was interesting to come into a school and you would be the only black teacher, and I was interviewed, as if they ran out and found me in the street and that I didn't have an education. But sooner or later, they got used to us. And there were principals that really went out of their way to be able to make their faculty diverse. So there were a few of those there. So,
you know, one thing I didn't mention to the audience is that we're going to open it up shortly for questions for both the audience here and people on Zoom, so get your questions ready, because we will be ready for them soon. Alisa, how did it affect the kids who went through busing? And I ask you that both because you went through it yourself, and as did other members of your family, but also now you deal with young people all day long running a Boys and Girls Club.
There's trauma, you know.
Tell me about that.
Like I said, you know, there was a time I lived in New York and I came back home and I was going down Dot, and I got this eerie feeling. It was just I was just about to approach that corner that we had to go down the bus, in the seats of the bus. You know, trauma in the sense that, again, we're these young kids and, you know, you're being spit on, you're being cursed at, you're having things hurled at you every day. And to some degree, you know, I still don't necessarily go into certain parts of Boston because that wasn't my Boston. I wasn't welcome there. I often think about, and I don't know the number of kids who may have dropped out of school because it was just too much to deal with every day. You know, I think this conversation is going to have me, reach out to like, how did this impact you? But I think I was too young to absorb it, but so much. But I'm thinking about those who were in high school. Like, why would I go to school every day where I don't have the ability to focus and concentrate on the lessons I'm supposed to be there to get? So I'm quite sure there's probably a portion of our generation here in the city that was impacted in an adverse way, and they didn't complete their education because of the environments in which they were forced to go to school. Yeah.
Yeah. So as the person on this panel who is not from Boston, I've lived here 34 years, so I'm still a newcomer. One thing that's always struck me about busing is the way it defined the way Boston was thought of around the country. I remember being 12 years old and watching TV and seeing people throwing rocks at buses in South Boston. And for millions of people, it was like that became especially black people, that became the way they think of Boston. What do you think the effect of, this question is for whoever wants to take it. What do you think the effect of busing has been on the image and reputation of this city?
It was tough for them to find teachers to come here. So
Yeah.
people were afraid. And I think they say, oh, Boston's racist. And that's been, maybe it's gradually slowing down, but the last 30 years, that's how people perceived us as a racist city, based on busing. Because the real person came out. The real situation came out. Those hidden things. Because I went to the Boston Public Schools. I was born and raised in Boston. I went to the Boston Public Schools. We read Little Black Sambo. And my mother went up there and made a fuss. So it was difficult. It was difficult. So, what do you think?
I think part of it is like, when you think about Boston having this, history of abolitionists and so forth, and, people had a perception that there were freedoms here. And to find that there was this systemic racism here, and it had all this violence, and it was this powder keg that was let loose, I think that's why it was shocking to people. Racism in Boston is no different from other places. When I moved to other places, I was like, Boston is so racist. I was like, I've been in parts of New York. It's not different, Yeah. It's just that I think because of that we're a higher education capital, people probably perceive that we were above that. And I do think that sometimes, racism can be intellectualized. And, that's why this conversation is great, because there were some of us who actually lived through that systemic racism and efforts to sort of dismantle it. And there was some backblow that came from that.
Yeah.
Zebulon?
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. Hubie Jones calls Boston up south. It's you have to think about, in the example I was trying to give before, like Roberts, how the North's role, Boston's role in establishing some of those things going way back. I think that's absolutely right. People had a higher standard for Boston. It's in part, I think, when I interviewed people for the book, I heard over and over again, especially people who came to Boston, of which is so many, come to school here and then end up staying. A lot from New York, a lot of other places. And everyone said the same thing, like, I came thinking, I was reading the great poets and, the literature and, the sort of New England schoolhouse and the symbolism of that and, Emily Dickinson and that kind of thing. And thinking, they're going to be received and welcomed, and finding much to their surprise that Boston was kind of a cold place in a lot of ways, was not welcoming. A lot of that, that was shocking, probably to everyone except those in Boston, to the outside. And so, some of the early kind of platitudes, Boston as a city upon a hill, shining brightly, probably has given people sort of a false standard of what it was. But it also depends on when because you have a lot of changes in the demographics in Boston in the 20th century. A lot of new immigrants and groups that were coming to Boston who, sort of replaced those who were in power previously. And that's a big sea change that's sometimes goes without notice. Like, it's kind of like, different kinds of white people. You had the Yankee, the sort of Boston, class. But then in 20th century, you begin to see just like all Irish mayors all throughout the 20th century. And so when the Irish American sort of comes to preeminence in Boston, that a lot of things begin to change, because these two groups were really pitted against each other in so many ways, in terms of labor and politics and a lot of things. They have more in common than people think. And I think that has a lot to do with the shock. This is a different kind of groups of people in power in the 20th century who themselves had kind of been discriminated against and were looking to empower.
Oh, and they've never let anyone forget it.
Yeah, pretty much, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a key to understanding some of that, why Boston goes from being the city of abolitionists to a more racist city in the 20th century.
So that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, where are we now?
I see you looking my way.
I'm just looking down the road.
Yeah.
Where are we now?
Where are we now in terms of equity?
Getting better. We have more diverse city, much more diverse than when I grew up. It was, I think we're the black, maybe under 2%, I think, when I was growing up, of black residents. And so many of the residents lived in the South End. Now we can't afford the South End, but that's where they were. Many of the immigrants, a lot of them from the Caribbean, settled in the South End and then eventually moved around. But it's better, but it was very difficult going to school. They call us all kinds of names. Oh, I'm telling you, it was really rough, but I got rough after a while. I had twin cousins, and we just sassed them back. And the teachers weren't very nice. Mother was up there all the time. My mother would go to the school committee. She wasn't going to put up with any nonsense because she said, we pay taxes. Right. And we deserved a good education. So that's the kind of household I grew up. We're going to fight, and we're going to fight for our rights. So things are better. It's much more friendly now. We see all different kinds of people. It's just wonderful. I love it, But, it's always that little nudge there. But for the most part, I think we've come a long way. I think so.
And I would say the same in terms of the city feeling more open. You're not feeling, landlocked. I often talk to some older Boston families, because we all know each other. We're like 1 degree of separation. And I think part of it is because we all had to live and raise families in restricted communities, if you will. So, so there's this community, but there's this family that was developed in that. But now, we're all over metropolitan Boston. I'm seeing, younger professionals of color moving here and having their families settle here. So I think that is a reflection of how the city is changing. But I think one of the things that we always have to be mindful of is that, there's the systemic racism that you still have to chip away at. And that's going to take some time. But I do think the diversity of the city is a reflection of that we're changing, or our perception as a city is changing, because they're moving from Delaware, they're moving here from the South, and they're mainly moving here because of career opportunities. And I think with businesses having a focus on DEI, I think that's helping the city. I know the partnership and Benny Wiley and her organization, they're very, very much a part of the effort to change the reputation or the image of the city as a place for people to do business and to raise a household, or a family, I should say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I was coming along, which is again after kind of this in the '80s and stuff, you really, you couldn't go to every neighborhood. Like my family didn't go to. I never even saw South Boston or Charlestown or a lot of these places. We really were sort of stayed in our place. You couldn't buy a house there or anything like that. And maybe you could work there, but you'd be kind of, by nightfall, you'd be skedaddling back out of there. And that's what I remember. A few times when we finally did go to some of these other places, we got chased, and me and my friends and that kind of thing. And that's, that's changed. Black family can buy a house at Charlestown or West Roxbury or South Boston, as they should be able to. It's changed in that sense, the level of violence and the rigidly sort of policed neighborhood borders and lines have disappeared to some extent. I won't say 100, but in large part. And honestly, I think a lot of that, just my humble opinion, has to do with the school desegregation. I think a lot of that, that's maybe the one silver lining that came out of it, changed the city in a lot of ways, in difficult ways, but also the sort of lasting legacy of it is a more open city, one that's been quite financially successful, I might add. And a lot of that has to do with some of the people like Ruth Batson, the Hugh B. Jones, and the visionaries who saw a different way and said, and Gene McGuire's and and our panelists, we can move in another direction. They saw a more open Boston, one that is more truer to its origins than it became. And so I think it's, there's still work to do. Of course, it's a great place, one with so many firsts. When you have the first public high school in America, Boston Latin, you have Harvard, you have all these amazing firsts. There's almost a higher, more nobler kind of standard that we have to live up to. So it's a lot of, we have to put all these smart people in Boston to work so that we can, imagine a better, even better city as we go forward. Because there are still a lot of things to be worked on.
Right.
And
I think
you do
it's
see
time.
black
I'm
students
sorry, go
at
ahead.
Boston Latin School now,
It's right.
Boston Latin Academy, yeah. So
Yeah.
at least it's integrated those schools that was strictly for the kids that came from West Roxbury and places like that. Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
We're going to open it up to audience questions, and I'm going to start with a question from a member of our Zoom audience. So we are here this evening bearing witness to this fraught period in Boston's history, and I appreciate the viewpoint from a teacher, a student, and obviously Dr. Miletsky is a professor at Stonybrook. The question I'll start off with is, what are your ideas for how to teach our Boston Public School students and teachers about this history? So as we're approaching the 50-year mark, in some ways it feels like yesterday, and in some ways it feels like forever ago. Have you given any thought to how we want to teach this period, this era? How would we want to teach this history to Boston Public School students?
Well, there's a great book out now. And if Boston Public Schools wants to buy 10,000 copies, there is, all jokes aside, there's a lot of new approaches, some new books, and also some other really good resources. There was a group called Primary Source, if anyone's familiar, out in Watertown, they've always had a great curriculum that I don't know if it's how often it gets used, but with lesson plans and worksheets and all kinds of interesting stuff that people can use right away. Panels like this, obviously, are great. Where we're kind of just having these more intimate discussions, and people can lean in and talk these things through. There's the documentary. I think is a good way, and some of the groups like Lou Finfer's and Carolyn Crockett's group, which I'm also part of, the busing initiative, Boston Busing and Desegregation Initiative. It's creating forums so we can have a discussion. I think read a little, work a little, and have a discussion is the best way.
Right, I'm going to stick with the Zoom audience with one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to our in-person audience. So this is a question: what are the lessons learned from the busing experience? And what actions are now recommended for Boston to improve quality education, not just integration? So this goes to this notion of what does an equitable school system look like today? So I'm gonna ask you, Alisa, if you'll take the first stab at that question.
Okay, what I think about is allowing parents the opportunity or options to select schools that are in their neighborhoods, that are resourced, that provide their children the skills and the aptitudes that they need to see themselves in the local Boston or Massachusetts economy. I think those are the things that people want, is they want to have the ability to have something that's local. I mean, I think about a lot of the kids that I work with, a lot of them go through the MECO program. They're getting up at 4:30 in the morning, 5 a.m. to get on the bus to go out to the Marbleheads and the Lexingtons to go to school. And then they have a full day and they come to the club. And so they have like 12, 14-hour days.
Yeah.
That start because their parents want to give them access to higher education, but they have to be bused outside of Boston to get the education that they're seeking, or they have to go into these very competitive charter school lotteries and so forth. People just want the choice, and they want the options to be local to them, and they want to have the agency and autonomy to make those decisions and not be bused into to be forced into certain school selections that are available in the city.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up to the audience. I have a question here.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy learning more. I'm a new Bostonian for real, not 34 years, 34 days. But I'm a Detroiter, and we have done busing in Detroit as well. And Marilyn and Alisa, both of your comments got me thinking about a group that I haven't heard a lot about, and that's the role of the bus drivers. So you indicated praying, right, before you even got on the bus, in theory that you would make it there safely from what was happening to the bus. But I'm also wondering about the bus drivers themselves. They're members of the community as well. They had feelings, and I'm wondering if there were any interviews or any data that we might have on what their thoughts were, if they ever thought about derailing, if they ever thought about not taking folks, if there was harm to them as well or threats to them. So I'm just wondering if we know anything about them.
It's really a great question. That was also one of the Zoom questions we have. I'll throw this out as well. As a 37-year-old Boston school bus driver, I'd love to hear the panelists' views on drivers who supported the struggle. Oh, you did?
Is that...
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
I'll say something about that.
Okay.
One of my best friends was a guy named Bill McGonigal, who was a guy from Southie, who was a bus driver in 1974 and went on to run the Boston Housing Authority. And I will tell you that he never stopped talking about what it was like driving those buses into Southie in 74 in his neighborhood, but buses full of black kids, and how horrifying it was to go through that experience. I mean, I think bus drivers I've talked to really felt that a lot and continue to.
Yeah, they had to go to the Boston Teachers Union to meet the faculty.
Right.
They drove to the union, and the buses were there to drive them to the schools. So I'm sure, I never, and unfortunately, I never really thought about the bus drivers, But yeah, that's a good question.
It's a wonderful question.
They were effectively cops without badges.
Yeah.
They protected us.
Yeah.
I mean, the bus drivers and the bus monitors, because again, it was that bus monitor to tell us, hey, we're about to turn this corner. You got to get up below the window.
Yeah.
So they were truly at the front lines. They're the ones that made the call on whether or not you had to detour off the route because maybe the crowd was a little bit too intense or too dense at a particular juncture. So, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the bus driver because they protected us. We wouldn't have been able to go in and come out but for them.
All right, so sir, I'm going to give you the microphone, and then I'm going to give it to Lou. You can pass it to Lou when you finish.
I don't want to take up a lot of time. My name is Steve Gillis. I drove a school bus for 37 years in Boston. I thought this was maybe about us. I don't want to sound like a narcissism, but driving for desegregation, that's what we did. And, Adrian is so right. I think it was on the 40th anniversary, Adrian, that the Boston Globe did a series called History Drove In on a School Bus, and it included both a video and a transcript of an interview of the first bus driver who drove from basically Dudley Square to South Boston High School on the first day, Jimmy Little Richardson. It's an amazing interview if you haven't looked back on it in a while. But, he described in the way we looked at it, not just in the 70s, this went on for 20 years. In October 1985, one of my dear friends, Glenda Hector, was driving a van into Charlestown and, with racist expletives flying, was hitting the side of the head with a brick, and she eventually died from that, just like Daryl Williams died from the sniper shot, 20 years later or whatever. But we viewed ourselves, as you put it, Adrian, as the cops. We went to work for decades with crash helmets, with clubs that we could say we were using to check the air pressure in our tires. We went out for not just self-defense, but we were the parents, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles of the children that we were driving. And we organized early on, early bus drivers organized probably, by some accounts, one of the largest civil rights demonstrations in the United States on December the 14th, 1974, right here in Boston. It's little talked about. It didn't make the PBS documentary, but some 20 to 25,000 people came to Boston. The keynote speaker was Reverend Ralph Abernathy of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Senator Bill Owens led the march. I just happened to pull out the photograph from the Globe's obituary in January 22 of Senator Owens standing on top of a police car that day, surrounded by 20,000 people when the police blocked our way up Boylston Street, said we were never getting to the Boston Common. But, I didn't come here to give a speech. I really, I'm in awe of Professor Miletsky's book. I think it does the work that Kyra Singleton is doing at the Royal House to flip history on its head and tell the story of a victory and not a tragedy, as so many other narratives have claimed. Thanks.
And then if you could pass it to Lou. And Lou, if you'll introduce yourself.
Sure. Lou Finfer. I'm a community organizer, and I'm co-chair of something called the Boston Desegregation and Busing Initiative that's been mentioned, and we're a co-sponsor of the forum, and we've been organizing forums and exhibits and partnerships around this 50th anniversary, and we had our first forum on September 26th at Roxbury Community College that UB Jones and Jean McGuire and Lida Peters and some of the people, and Zeb spoke at and so forth. And we're planning at least 4, and there'll probably be many more forums next year. But I wanted to recognize and thank Steve for his testimony, the bus driver's role. And there is a woman, there's been a research project to do oral histories and statements by bus drivers. So some of that is being captured in an organized way, but more has to be done. I also wanted to mention, sorry, I'm talking long, but the question about how is this taught? There is something going forward, the Facing History in Ourselves, which many people know their work on. They are working on a curriculum for the Boston Public Schools to use in the fall of next year. And 6 teachers that are part of our initiative, who are retired teachers, but who taught in the 70s, in the same time as you, and you probably know a number of them, Deborah Dancy and Peggy Kempe and others. They've reviewed this curriculum, and they're giving comments to the Facing History group, and then they're going to be meeting with BPS people who are also meeting on themselves. So there is going to be teaching of this. We're planning to ask, they're right now initially planning to do it with 8th grade civics teachers, which is good. We're also going to be making a request to the superintendent that they do something for all at least 6th to 12th graders, just because it's such a momentous event in our city's history. So thank you.
How can people find out about some of the programs of the Boston busing and desegregation? How can people learn more about what you have in store in the coming year?
Well, we're developing a website, but we haven't. So probably the best is people can email me, and we'll put you on a list to get notified of forums. And so I'll say what my email is, but people can also come up to me afterwards. My email is lewfinfer, lewfinfer@gmail.com. And we'll put you on the list for the forums. And people can come up to me afterwards and give me their name as well. But thank you for allowing me to talk and do that.
So I reminded Lou I had met him in 1992, and he was doing this important work back then, and you're still doing it. I want to lift you up and honor you.
Yeah, yeah.
So Alyssa, I have another Zoom question. This is directed to you. Knowing what you know now and the experiences you have, and you've talked very poignantly about the trauma. Alyssa and I talked for well over an hour about her experience, and you brought tears to my eyes. You really did. It brought back memories. I'm also a Boston public school teacher. I taught during court-ordered desegregation, so I've walked not in your shoes, but in other shoes. So the question is, was it worth it? Was it worth it if you had the choice to make, and I know the answer because I asked you the same question. If you had to make the choice for your younger self, would you have chosen to be bused?
No. And I say that because of the trauma that comes from it. Because that was a lot of weight to put on children, because adults wouldn't allow the integration to happen in a methodical, reasonable way. And like I mentioned earlier, I believe that impacted some people's relationship to education, dropping out or not excelling to their fullest intellectual capabilities. It's made us a more open city, but there are children, there are generations that carried that burden to this day. So the city may be open, but we probably had a genius somewhere that just mentally checked out of school because it was just too much. So I would say no.
I wouldn't put my son on the bus. He was supposed to be bused to Charlestown. And we did go to the Charlestown, had a meeting, and had the priest that came out and welcomed us and so on. And I said, okay, maybe it may not be too bad. But on our way home, they were throwing rocks at our car. And so, would I put my child on the bus? And I decided I wasn't.
Here, we have a question here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel. It's really stimulating and got me thinking a lot. I teach here at Suffolk. I'm in the English department. And I teach a couple of texts, or I'm about to teach one. I was talking to Zebulon before, by Dennis Lehane, his new book, Small Mercies, which is set in this era. And I teach Michael Patrick MacDonald's All Souls as well, which is a memoir that takes place in this era. Both of them are written later on, looking back. And one of the themes that emerges in both is that there's a sense that that really class has a lot to do with this, right? That you said earlier, Zebulon, that the sort of Boston Irish and African American communities are pitted against each other, and that's what begins to kind of come out with that, and resentment toward the judges, the politicians, other invisible power structures that are sort of controlling the whole thing. Maybe that's just happening in retrospect. I'm not sure, but I wonder if you could comment, any of you, a little bit about how, because this was a political mess, right? It was, did it change Boston politics? Did it change attitudes towards social class? Did it change, anything? Or is it just sort of this shameful moment that we look back on? Some people don't want to look back on it, and others who do are having trouble processing it, putting it into context. Did anything in terms of the class structure, power structure, political structure change because of it? Irrevocably.
Yeah, it's kind of again, not to keep, we are in the law school here, so maybe it's appropriate, but a lot of it has to do with the law. Unfortunately, fortunately, I suppose, I'm not sure now, but the Racial Imbalance Act, which was passed in 1965, and because the school committee literally refused to comply with state law, which, Boston comes under that rubric, and were asked repeatedly to come up with a plan for school desegregation, one that might have been a little better, might have been a little less difficult on families. And because they refused to do that and never submitted anything, even when funding was cut, even in all these measures, the intransigence of the school committee, to not comply with what was state law, and the Racial Imbalance Act had already put in place a provisional plan, one that was not ideal, but it was the one that basically proposed to bus students from those two particular neighborhoods of South Boston and Roxbury. And so by the time the court order is given, there's not a lot of time left. I think it's like maybe 90 days until the school year started. So that was the only plan available, basically. So that is to say, because of the lack of preparation and planning. The other piece, someone mentioned Detroit. The other piece is Judge Garrity was waiting to see what was going to happen in terms of this case. Thank you. Yeah, Milliken versus Bradley in Detroit, which would have, proposed a metropolitan approach, which would have involved the surrounding areas. Detroit is a predominantly black city. You weren't going to bring about integration by just busing kids within Detroit. It had to involve the 6 mile, 7 mile, the 8 mile, and all that. But that was ruled basically unconstitutional, a metropolitan approach. So it left Garrity with the only option was within the city of Boston. Now, see, I'm of the opinion that a metropolitan approach would have been a lot better, would have been more effective, and probably would have, we don't know for sure, but would have had a little less of the trauma. I'm not gonna, I came like after busing, so I can't speak to anyone who went through that, and I would never try to. I didn't walk in those shoes. But it's kind of like the pinball that falls, gets hit and knocked around, and it kind of falls to the bottom. And because of the way that the game was set up, so to speak, legally, it really just left that as the only option. So a lot of people wonder about that. Why did it have to be that way? And a lot of it is just sort of the way the law worked.
I would like to say, after 30 plus years of talking to people about busing in the city, that I get mildly annoyed when I hear white people constantly say it was really about class, not race. I mean, if you look at the footage, you look at what people were saying, you look at what people were doing. I mean, race was a big part of this. And I have spent a lot of time listening to people say, oh, busing was really about class. And it was about class, yes, absolutely, but it wasn't just about class.
Well, we have time for
Mr.
one.
Sell, excuse me, we got a perfect person to talk about.
Okay, so
how
we
it
have time for
changed
2
Boston
more
politics.
questions. I'm going to
go
give you
ahead.
the microphone. I need you to talk into the microphone.
Yeah, speaking as a native Detroiter, 6 Mile, Illinois, I have always argued that Milliken versus Bradley was essentially the repeal of Brown versus the Board of Education, because it meant that most of the country of means would not be part of court-ordered desegregation. It introduced class into something that was basically an overt expression of racism. And I often ask, what would be different if Brookline, surrounded by 3.5 sides, where the buses had to go through to move to Brighton, would have been involved? You know, it's one of these, like, if one thing were different. I mean, Milliken versus Bradley was a 5-4 decision. In other words, 4 of the justices said that suburbs should be part of court-ordered school desegregation. It meant that suburbs would now be exempt from Brown versus Board of Education. That's just fact. And it's not spoken to enough. And I know, Adrian, it sounds like I'm arguing it was about class. I'm not. Race.
No.
It was about race. But it introduced class because it insulated those of means, even when they were geographically next door. It's just, you know, something to contemplate, not to conclude anything from it, but Brown versus Board of Education ceased to be about the affluent white communities of America when the judges 5-4 decided that suburbs would be exempt from school desegregation under the law.
That's a good point. Gene McGuire says, you know, it's not the bus, it's us, you know.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We're
that's it. That's
running
all I
a
have to
little
say.
over, so we have time for one final question. This gentleman has had his hand up for a while.
Mark of a good discussion when you're running over.
Well, thanks so much. So I'll just throw 2 quick questions, and then whichever ones you can answer. So
Pick one.
this history doesn't exist permanently anywhere in this city. There is no museum, there is no space, there is no institution that any Bostonian or visitor of Boston can go to grapple with this history. I'm always stunned by that, particularly when I visit the South, and there are so many interpretive centers. Across the street from the courthouse in Tallahatchie, you can have an interpretive experience with someone trained in interpreting history to help heal, to help further discussions. Seems like this is always frozen in time, encapsulated by the person with whom you're talking to. And then that's where the conversation starts and ends for most people. So I'm wondering if, for you all, what are your thoughts about this history maybe having a permanent home somewhere in the city of Boston made available to people, you know, all the time?
Great question. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take a stab at that. Adrian, I'm going to start with you. I'm being the moderator now. Adrian?
I've been fired. I'm all for it. I'm all for a permanent place to wrestle with this history. I think it would be a great thing to have.
I agree as well, and I think that goes to an earlier question, like how do you teach or how do you continue to have conversations around it such that that kind of situation, those dynamics don't come to exist in the future.
I totally agree with that. That would be a great asset to Boston to really reveal what it is that we went through, and it cannot disappear. You cannot erase history.
I agree. I would just add, Metco was mentioned a lot. Their offices in now Nubian Square, they do have a really amazing exhibit there that not enough people know about, that does tell this history in these panels that go all the way around the room. And I would encourage you or anybody, to go and visit. It's new. It's very new, so maybe people haven't heard about it yet. But that's a start, and there needs to be even more done with this.
Well, the great thing about anniversaries in lieu of, permanent sites is that it's going to give us all a great opportunity to talk about and revisit the legacy of busing.
Great, thank you. And on that note, I want to conclude the program by thanking you, Adrian, Alisa, Marilyn, and Zebulon for a really interesting and enlightening conversation. I'd like to thank our audience, both those here with us and those on the Zoom call. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. And I want to lift up and honor and give credit to all the black and white organizers, the parents and children who fought long and hard battles for justice, who have been left out of the standard narrative of the civil rights movement, who fought hard to eradicate Jim Crow in Boston and in the North. I want to lift them up and honor them and thank them. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.